Okay, let's get started. Okay, thank you very much for joining our 19th special dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. And my name is Hiromi Murakami of the Global Health Innovation Policy Program facilitating this dialogue series. We're very honored to welcome very special guests from Washington, D.C. and our very special friend, Dr. Zack Cooper. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. We're so excited in hearing his views on pandemic and Ukraine and Taiwan, challenges for Japan and the United States. And today's session is co-sponsored by US Embassy Tokyo. We very much appreciate their support. While we're still struggling with COVID-19, we're shocked by what's happening in Ukraine. In addition to that, in response to Mrs. Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we're seeing increasingly that China's hostile activities in the region. And today we're living in a quite different world where we face many challenges in economy, security, energy, and the fundamental values we embrace. Obviously, Ukraine situation tells us that Japan will face a lot of challenges in the future. But Japan is still not yet figured out, what to do next. So in this occasion, we're very pleased to welcome expert like Zack and Zack's view, and as he's also an expert of crisis simulations, and we're grateful for him sharing his analysis and concerns with us today. With that, I'd like to pass the microphone to Zack. We very much appreciate you taking time for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Murakami-san. It's wonderful to get the chance to see you and to see a number of friendly names on the list. And I'll really look forward to the discussion with everyone in a couple of minutes. I wanted to provide a few thoughts really about the place that the United States and Japan find ourselves right now, both in East Asia, but also a little bit more broadly in the global environment. And I thought it would make sense to start with a little bit of a discussion of maybe where we've come over the last 5 years or so, including during the pandemic. And one of the things that I've enjoyed the most is getting a chance with you, Hiromi, and with GHIPP and also with GRIPS to do these crisis simulations and really getting a chance to see how closely connected health issues are to security issues and vice versa. And I think we've seen that loud and clear in real life, unfortunately, over the last 3 years. And so I want to just talk a little bit about how I think that's changing the regional environment in particular, but also the global environment as well. So from my perspective, the place to begin on the US-Japan alliance is that I think the US-Japan alliance is arguably as strong as it has ever been. And, we see this in lots of different ways. We see very high support in terms of polling, not perfect levels of support. There are questions that people in both countries ask of the other. But, this is a completely different relationship, obviously, than the one that existed in parts of the 1990s, where there were real deep tensions. Now I think what you see is Japan and the United States increasingly aligned on issue after issue. And I really think of maybe 4 issues where our interests are very closely aligned. The first is security. So, of course, the top challenge for Japan is China and its rise, not just East China Sea and Senkaku Islands, but more broadly, China's security outlook. And I think that is driving the United States and Japan closer together on the military side than we've seen, certainly in any time since the middle of the Cold War. Then you've got economic issues. And here again, the big driver, I think, of concern in Tokyo to some degree is Chinese behavior and this fear that actually both the United States and Japan have become somewhat too dependent on Chinese production of various things, whether it's microchips or other types of goods, pharmaceutical ingredients, et cetera. But also that we are dependent on China's market in certain areas, and that this poses some serious risks. And I'll get into this a bit more. I'm not going to suggest that we should see decoupling, at least not total decoupling between our economies and China's. But I certainly think we're seeing a bit of a trend towards what I would call selective decoupling. So, in those two areas, security and economics, clearly the US-Japan alliance is, I think, closer than it's been in at least several decades. A third area is technology. And here, I would say we're still at the beginning of the cooperation. The US and Japan have very similar interests on technology issues because we both have huge and important technology companies. And, this seems sort of obvious, but I'll just note as somebody that also does some work on the US alliances in Europe, this is actually a big difference from American alliances in Europe. There are very few leading technology companies throughout most of Europe. There's some great and important European companies, but very few are cutting edge technology leaders like you have in Japan and in the United States. So again, here we have very large, very advanced technology industries in both countries, and concerns about intellectual property theft from various countries, especially China, concerns about protectionism and efforts to limit data flows on both sides. And some of this, in fact, comes from within Japan, within the United States sometimes. So on technology issues, I think we're starting to see more and more cooperation. And I'll talk a little bit more about what some are calling sort of the GHIPP-4 or FAB-4 grouping that involves our two countries, Japan and the United States, as well as Taiwan and perhaps Korea. And then the final area where I think you see increasing alignment between the United States and Japan is on what I would call sort of global governance issues. So this includes human rights, democracy, climate. And here, to be candid, often for a long time, Japan was a little quieter on these issues. And I think what we've seen, and Prime Minister Abe certainly was a leader in this regard, is Japan standing up and being much more active on all of these sorts of issues, right? Much more active on democracy and human rights issues compared to what we've seen in the past. A leader on a variety of climate issues. So in global governance, I think we're seeing more and more, not just that this is an issue that's important to the United States, but that it's important to the Japanese people and the Japanese government as well. So I'm very bullish on where the US-Japan alliance is headed. And I think the rationale across these four areas, across security, economics, technology, and global governance, is in many ways driven by concerns about China. And in an American thought process, this is sort of a good thing in some ways. The fact that the leadership in Tokyo, the leadership in Washington, they see a lot of the same challenges from Beijing. I think this can be very beneficial. And I'll just note, we can talk more about Ukraine in the discussion, but I think one lesson that the United States has taken away from Russia's war in Ukraine is that actually having a common threat can be a really genuine unifying factor, right? There was a lot of talk maybe a year ago about some fraying between the US alliances in Europe. Questions about where France and Germany, the United Kingdom, were going to come out on various issues, divisions within Europe between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Don't get me wrong, those are all still there, and you all know this well that study this issue, but they're much less severe than they were. And the reason is simply that Russia appears to be so directly threatening European unity that it's forced Europe together, and together with the United States. And I think China is having a similar effect on the US-Japan alliance, and not just on the US and Japan, but on Korea, on Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, India. And so I think, what we're seeing in many ways is China pushing the United States and Japan closer together, and not just closer together ourselves, but closer together with a number of other key partners. But here's where I think some of the challenges lay. So very often when you hear US policymakers talk about this, you'll hear a lot of nuance from the Biden administration, but there's not a lot of nuance often from other US leaders, especially members of Congress when it comes to China issues, right? And you'll often hear people talking about sort of democracy in a fight with autocracy. You might hear about, China as sort of antithetical to much of what the United States is pursuing, right? The US and its friends are pursuing a rules-based order, and China wants to undermine that order. This is sort of the language you often hear, and it sets up this dichotomy, right? The sort of black and white division between the United States on the one hand and China on the other. And it leads to obvious questions about, well, where do other countries come down? And here, the easy thing for the United States is a country like Japan. Americans talk about whether there's any country in the world that's really closely aligned with the United States on every issue. And almost always the first answer that people say is Japan, right? Maybe the United Kingdom, maybe Australia, but those three are really the leading countries that on issue after issue, their interests seem extremely aligned with those of the United States. But most of the world, I think, finds itself in the awkward position of not being fully on board with the United States on these issues or fully on board with China. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is the case, at least in my view, and what I think some of the implications are. So I think the real challenge is that the world is multipolar. And I think people sitting in Tokyo tend to appreciate this a little bit better than people sitting in Washington. Here in Washington, we got very used to, after World War II, a bipolar system, right? Up until, let's say, 1990, 91. And then we had the unipolar moment, which lasted at least somewhere into the 2000s. And then it was really unclear, maybe from 2005 or 2010 onward, what this universe was that we were entering. The US was still very clearly the dominant player, easily the largest economy in the world, easily the largest spender on defense issues, treaty ally of 30-some countries around the world, including, by the way, most of the large industrial democracies in the world. So it's not that the United States wasn't the dominant player globally, but it increasingly was being challenged to a greater extent than it had been, certainly in the middle of the 1990s, for example. And those challenges, we talk a lot about them coming from China, and I absolutely think that China is probably the most severe challenge, especially over the long term, if nothing else, just because it has the most economic potential. But there are other challenges as well. Russia, obviously, is high on the list. But then there are a group of countries that aren't direct challengers to the United States, but aren't exactly part of the US pole. And I think here, I would say Europe often falls in this category, despite the fact that the United States and Europe have a very close alliance in NATO. European countries, especially some of the larger European countries like France and Germany, often take very different positions from the United States, right? And we've seen that more and more, at least dating back to, perhaps the invasion of Iraq. Then we've got India, which absolutely is trending, I think, in a very positive direction from an American and a Japanese point of view, but still has very different interests. And I think increasingly is demonstrating that although it aligns with Tokyo and Washington on many issues, that Delhi is going to go its own way on other issues. So the one that stood out to me recently was the fact that Indian military forces exercised with Russia and with China and a bunch of others in the Russian Far East, right? I mean, this is pretty notable. And in fact, part of that exercise took place in the Northern Territories. Now, India didn't join in that portion of the exercise, but I think you can see its stance on Ukraine as well as another sign that India is going to stake out its own position on some issues. And then you have a wide range of countries that I think don't fall neatly into any sort of clear category, right? So most African countries aren't clearly aligned one way or the other between the United States and China. They might be better described as we described them in the Cold War as sort of non-aligned, right? Same thing in Latin America, especially with the leftward trend in Latin America, a number of recent elections that are bringing to power people who are openly questioning the role of the United States in Latin America. And even closer to home in Southeast Asia, right? Where, I think you've seen a real serious democratic backslide in much of Southeast Asia, and real questions about whether a lot of Southeast Asian countries want to be so closely aligned to the United States. So the picture I'm trying to paint here is one in which I think it's much easier for Americans to think of this world as maybe a bipolar world, right? A world of great power competition between the United States and China. But I think for most people outside of the United States or outside of China, the world looks very different. It looks much more multipolar, right? And I don't think we would necessarily agree. If you tried to take a poll of everyone here, I think we'd all come up with a different number of polls that we think are in the system, right? Some might think there are 3, some might think there are 5 or even 10. And this is sort of an academic debate. It's an interesting debate, but academic nonetheless. But I think what matters here is that it's not really a case of countries having to choose between the United States and China. Because first, many of the countries don't have to choose at all. And second, a lot of the countries can choose to go with other poles, right? They could choose to align more with Japan, or to align more with Europe, or to align more with India, or Russia for that matter. And we're seeing countries do all of these things in some cases. I think there's some good examples of this in Southeast Asia, right? Where countries are trying to avoid having to clearly align with, say, the United States or China, but are increasingly aligning more closely with, say, Japan, right? And I think this is going to continue to happen. So what's very complex in my mind about this universe is that we've got countries aligning differently on different issue sets as well. So it's not just that they're not divided between the United States and China. It's also that on issue after issue, they might take very different positions. So let me just give you 2 examples that I think help dramatize this a little bit. So one is compare Korea's approach, South Korea's, and India's approach on some major issues, right? So when it comes to security issues, for example, I think what you've seen is India increasingly aligning with the United States and aligning with Japan, right? Through the Quad mechanism. And what's the reason for that? Well, India is very worried about China's role on the Sino-Indian border and its pressure on the Sino-Indian border in recent years. And so is looking to respond in part by tightening the security relationships with other powers, including the United States, including Japan, including to some degree Australia and others, France in recent years as well. South Korea, on the other hand, is in a very different position, right? South Korea, despite being increasingly worried about China, especially up until the Yoon government took power just a few months ago, was very hesitant to push back on China militarily, and very hesitant even to engage in, closer alliance signaling on China-related issues. And so here, what you have on, 2 important relationships for the United States, South Korea and India, was a real divergence. a rapidly deepening security relationship with India, and yet a sort of stagnant security relationship with Korea when it came to China issues. But that doesn't carry across all of those relationships. So in fact, I would say if you compare India and South Korea on another issue, technology, the situation has been almost completely reversed. On technology issues, it's South Korea that is most closely intertwined with the United States, and to some degree, increasingly with Japan. It's South Korea and leading South Korean companies like Samsung and SK Hynix that are working very closely with the United States on semiconductor issues, that are taking a lead on some of these groupings, like the GHIPP grouping that I mentioned earlier. And so I think you're seeing South Korea be very hesitant in the security sphere, but a little bit more willing to push forward on technology issues. What about India? Actually, on technology issues, India, this has been a really big challenge. And part of the reason is that India approaches some of these technology issues in ways that are more similar to China than they are to the United States or Japan. So data localization rules in India are quite stringent. Some limitations by the government on various freedom of speech have been significant. And so, you know, what Americans often think of as the context for US-China competition is US-Soviet competition, right? And in the competition with the Soviet Union, as I said, you had a bipolar system. Now we have a multipolar system. We also had a system back in the Cold War with the Soviet Union in which most countries were relatively similar, especially in the European context, in that each bloc was differentiated by a number of factors, not just one. They were differentiated by political systems, right? The NATO and key US allies, at least later in the Cold War, tended to be democratic. The Warsaw Pact was entirely communist. Then you had very different economic systems, right? You had a capitalist system in most of the West, and in most of the East, you had a socialist system. And you had across those areas also much more similar security concerns, especially in Europe. So everyone in Europe was worried about a conflict on the inter-German border. That worried France, it worried Belgium, it worried the Netherlands, it worried the United Kingdom and Spain and Portugal and Italy. Because everyone felt that if the Soviets couldn't be stopped at the inter-German border, then they wouldn't be stopped anywhere. Now what you have in Asia, especially, is a completely different situation, right? It's sort of everyone for themselves. China is threatening many of its neighbors, but the threat to South Korea is completely different from this threat to Japan, right? The primary concerns for all of these close friends of the United States are different. For Japan, it's probably the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, right? As I think you'd often hear leaders say. For South Korea, it's probably North Korea primarily. For Taiwan, it's the Taiwan Strait. For India, it's the Sino-Indian border. For Vietnam, it's maybe the land border with China or the Paracel Islands. For the Philippines, it's probably the Spratly Islands. For Australia, it might be the Pacific Islands. For each of these countries, the security concern is different. So in other words, what you have is you have a much more varied set of relationships now than what you had in the Cold War. They're varied in terms of political systems, they're varied in terms of economic systems, and they're varied in terms of security concerns. And so in short, what we are now dealing with is a system in which there's much, much more complexity than anything we had to face during the Cold War. And look, I love Americans, but Americans are not always the best at dealing with incredibly complex situations, right? We like to boil things down to very simple principles. And the Cold War, in some ways, it lent itself to that way of thinking, right? There was Soviet bloc, there were American aligned countries, and the two were very specifically in a competition across all these areas. Now, what I think we're finding is actually that this complication is much, much more complex. So let me give you one example of that. I think if you look at how the Ukraine war is discussed in the United States versus, say, in China, you see a real divergence. And the way I would describe this is that in the United States, this is often described as a difference between the East and the West, right? In the West, you have support largely for Ukraine, right? And here, obviously, we don't just mean the West as in the transatlantic community. We also mean the leading democracies of Asia. So particularly Japan and Korea, Taiwan, Australia, perhaps New Zealand, even in Singapore, right? We've seen real leadership on Ukraine issues. And so, this is sort of set off against what we've seen, which is a bit of unity, at least some degree, between Russia, China, Belarus, North Korea, a handful of countries which are backing Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So I think many people in the United States tend to see this as sort of an East-West divide. But it's much more complex than that. And when I talk to Chinese colleagues, they often make the point that they don't see this as an East-West divide. They see it as a North-South divide, right, in terms of the global North and the global South. And they see this as advanced industrial democracies largely supporting Ukraine, and then smaller countries, a lot of which are not democratic or are struggling democracies or are just openly autocratic, are sort of sitting this out, right? They're not taking a strong position on Ukraine. And they're more worried about how they're directly affected, whether that's grain prices or inflation or energy prices, that these are the main priorities for them. And so one of the real challenges here, I think, is that this is going to force the United States and Japan to think much more carefully about how to do coalition building in this new environment that we're facing. And this is where I think Japan has an absolutely critical role to play. When the United States thinks about how to build coalitions, I think it can't just do this on its own. Often, actually, it's relying on a handful of countries to help guide those coalition building efforts. And I said at the outset that I think there are really three that are most close to the United States in outlook: Japan, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And I don't think it's should come as a shock that those are probably the three countries that the United States is working most closely with on these coalition building efforts, right? And it's the areas where we've seen the most progress recently: the creation of the Quad, the creation of the AUKUS arrangement with the US and Australia and the United Kingdom. This is really where a lot of the energy is for the United States. And I think often this is misinterpreted abroad as an effort by Washington to just deepen cooperation with Canberra or Tokyo or London. But the reality is, in my view, these relationships are actually largely not about those four countries. They're about how to relate with the rest of the world, right? So when I talk to Japanese experts and leaders, often they're providing insight for Americans about how to approach Southeast Asia. Because as everyone in Tokyo knows well, I actually think that Japan is far more popular than the United States in parts of Southeast Asia. It has a much longer track record of being a consistent economic player. And so when it came to something like IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, actually the United States, it didn't just try and get Japan on board. It actually took a lot of direction from Tokyo about how to build this framework and what Southeast Asian countries needed and how to include them in this group. I think we're seeing the same thing happen on the Pacific Islands. So in just about 2 weeks, the US government is going to hold a major summit of Pacific Islands in Washington, and it'll release a new strategy for the Pacific Islands as well. And I think one thing you're going to see is Japan is playing a bigger role in trying to explain how to engage a lot of these regions effectively. And that's really important. So, so part of this is an evolution of the US-Japan alliance away from just thinking about how to secure Japan and away from, what we would have called back in the 1990s situations in areas surrounding Japan, right, CICE-J, and more now towards a regional outlook and a global outlook. And I would say, I think that's really accelerated under Prime Minister Abe. I think it's continued, at least over the last few years. And I think the Kishida administration has carried on a lot of this momentum, and obviously it helped that the prime minister was foreign minister, and in his job as foreign minister had executed a lot of these initiatives as well. But I think the question from a US-Japan perspective now is, what are the next steps? How do we build on that cooperation and move forward? So I thought I would just give a couple of ideas, and then Murakami-san, I'll hand it back to you after that. So the first idea is, I think that we have to look for opportunities not to counter what China is doing, but to actually do what we do best. And so that means, in my mind, not always trying to counter, say, the Belt and Road Initiative, but actually looking for places where very high quality investment can make a difference. And part of what's very difficult here is we're not going to be able to invest at scale everywhere in the world. I think we've seen China try and do this, and to some degree it's backfiring in the sense that China made huge promises, trillions and trillions of dollars of promises around the world in terms of Belt and Road investment, and it can't follow through on a lot of those. And we don't want to be in a position where we're making big promises and can't follow through either. So we're going to have to prioritize the places that matter most to us. And I think some of those are obvious. One that is always foremost in my mind is a place like Indonesia, which is a huge and important country, a critical player, and I think someplace that just doesn't necessarily get the attention that it deserves, right? It is in many ways the heart of ASEAN, and yet probably doesn't have as close a relationship with the United States as it should, but it has a very excellent relationship with Japan. And so that's the kind of thing that we can capitalize on. The same thing on some of the Pacific Islands, which are increasingly important to the United States, but where the United States hasn't always given quite as much attention as we should. And there again, I think Japan can lend not just advice about how to invest effectively, but also about how to relate effectively to these countries and have a partnership, a true partnership with a lot of the Pacific Islands. So I think, step one is focus on what we do best and with the countries where we can help the most. So I'll give you an example of a country where I don't think we're going to be deeply engaged, in part because China has already made a lot of promises, which is a place like Pakistan, right? Where there's already a $50 billion promise from China to do a road and rail network through Pakistan. And if you go to most Japanese or American companies, they don't really want to put a lot of money into Pakistan. They're very worried about the return on investment there. And so I think we have to focus on the places that are going to have higher and more reliable returns on investment, or just absolutely critical from a security and strategic standpoint. And we've got to offer something positive. And what is it that we should offer? I think some of the most obvious things we can do, we should start with technology solutions, right? That's something that we can really bring to bear that others cannot. And so I think if we're thinking about bringing infrastructure and investment, one way we can do that is through technology investment. And things like 5G infrastructure are obvious, but I think that's just sort of the beginning of a lot of these investments. And I think we've seen the Biden team do a nice job at trying to refocus some of our engagement in this area. Another area where I think we can do a lot is global health. And a lot of you will know much more about this than I will, but I've just observed that when we look at the world today, the US and Japan are so lucky in many ways because we have access to incredibly high quality vaccines, right? So here in the United States, we just started vaccination for BA4 and BA5 specific vaccines, right? These basically were invented in 6 months. This is remarkable stuff. I don't think we use this enough from a diplomatic angle, right? It's, as much as we talk about how China is catching up on technology issues, the Chinese vaccines aren't effective. That's why China is in a zero COVID lockdown, which is going to be in for maybe another 12 months. While, here in the United States, for better or worse, we're basically open for business. And I know in Japan, you're hoping to open up a bit more as well. So I think there's a lot more we can do in terms of global health partnerships in a lot of the world, especially places where there's much less access to high quality vaccines. And I think there'll be a big desire for that kind of engagement. And then the third area, and I'll stop here in a moment and hand it back to you, Murakami-san, is I think we have to offer a positive economic engagement alongside our security engagement. And this is something that Japan has always done a wonderful job at, in part because Japan didn't do a lot of security engagement in much of the world. But one lesson for me is we absolutely have to start with our economic engagement first in most countries. And only then can we really build on that to have real security ties. And where we have security ties, but we don't have deep economic engagement, those relationships are often struggling pretty significantly. And so here I would say the most critical place is Southeast Asia. I think we absolutely have underinvested in Southeast Asia in terms of our economic inputs. This has been a challenge across administration. The Biden team knows this really well. They're putting more effort into Southeast Asia, but I think there's still more we can do. And Japan's pattern of business has worked really well. And if you look at polling data in Southeast Asia, you see that Japan is widely respected and widely trusted. So just one final point, because I know I haven't discussed it in detail, and I'm guessing we'll get to it in the questions. But I think what comes behind all of this is the need to have a stable relationship with China, right? And not to force countries to choose between the US and China, but to stand up for some basic principles that they can get behind. And this is another area where I think the US and Japan can play a leading role in articulating what those principles are. And I think it has to be more than what the Trump administration calls, sort of great power competition, what sometimes the Biden administration calls strategic competition, because most countries don't want to be caught in a great power competition. Malaysia might not be a great power and it doesn't want to be in the middle of that competition. But what it does want is some basic rules of the road, right? And it wants an order that's underpinned by those rules. And here I think we can put forward some pretty clear guidelines for the rules that we think should exist and that we're willing to fight for. And I hope that is part of what we see at the G7 next year. Hard to think of a better place to do that than Hiroshima, which has seen the downsides of serious conflict. And so I think this is sort of the agenda over the next 8 months heading into the G7 for the US and Japan. Can we use that meeting to set forth exactly what a positive agenda would look like? And I think the answer is yes. I think Japan is in the driver's seat to help Washington do this. And I'm therefore just incredibly bullish about the relationship and where it's headed. So with that, back to you, Murakami-san.
Okay, thank you very much for such a comprehensive view, up to date to the things that we're seeing on the news. So let me ask first question, but please, audience, please submit your questions if you have any to the Q&A box so that we can take your questions up. So first question I'm privileged to ask. You mentioned that the Japan-US alliance relationship is closer ever. And you pointed out 4 areas. And I have a question about the security area, which Japan is not too, the like for instance, cyber areas or technology, maybe not up to date as US level. So what exactly do US want Japan to do more, to have this sufficiently meeting these new challenges with this, US Japan more tightly together securing, alliance. Japan already announced that, they are trying to get to the 2% GDP budget for defense. We'll probably see that soon, but other things, what sort of thing do you expect Japan to do more from the US perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the timing is perfect because I think this is such a critical period for Japan's security outlook, both because of the national security strategy that will come out and the National Defense Program guidelines and the midterm defense plan. This is just a series of incredibly important decisions that Tokyo is going to have to make really over the next 3 or 4 months. And I'm very optimistic about where those are headed. They're obviously decisions for the Japanese people to make. I think, the United States will want to be supportive. I think, of course, the United States is happy to see Japan planning to spend more on defense. I think the US has been asking a lot of its allies and partners for years to spend a bit more on defense, and especially given the challenges we're seeing in Ukraine from Russia, on the Taiwan issue from China, I think it behooves Japan to really step up and be a leader. And obviously there are political constraints, some of which were imposed by the United States after the Second World War. But I think we're seeing Japanese leadership handle that appropriately, right? Moving in the right direction relatively quickly, all things considered. And so I think that's very positive on the defense spending levels. But what I think is much more important than defense spending levels is what we're actually doing. And here, for me, I think you noted some important, and frankly, difficult issues. Things like secrecy laws, right, which were updated during the Abe administration. I'll just highlight 2 areas where I think we need to work together more closely. And there's work to do on both Washington and Tokyo side. So first is, if you think about the US alliances around the world, the closest alliances we have, let's say NATO, Korea, Australia, 2 out of the 3 of those alliances, they have combined capability development, by which I mean we actually get together and we talk about what kinds of capabilities we need as allies, and then we jointly develop them in many cases. On the other hand, in the US-Japan alliance, we basically don't do that. The last time we tried that was SM3 Block 2A, which was a while ago when that program started now. So I think we need to do combined capability development the way NATO does this, the way Australia is doing it with the United States and the United Kingdom through AUKUS. The other thing I think we're going to need is to recognize that the challenge that we're seeing on Taiwan requires us to be much more closely integrated operationally. And look, the United States and Japan are remarkably integrated in many ways operationally, but I think the command structures still need a lot of rethinking. And in NATO, we have a combined command, right? We have allied command operations. In the US-Korea alliance, we have a combined command. We have the Combined Forces Command, CFC. Now, neither of these is perfect. They have their own problems. Having worked at NATO, I could recite them at length. But the difference here is that if we were in a major contingency with particularly China, I think we would find it very difficult for us to figure out exactly how to move our forces jointly. Maybe it would be difficult to communicate. And in a series of events where we'd have to move very, very quickly, I worry that we would not be able to do so as quickly as we would need to. So those for me are the 2 areas where I think we have a lot of work to do, and there should be a lot of urgency. They're not really about spending more. A lot of this is institutionally about how we work together. And so it takes some really smart bureaucrats in both Tokyo and Washington to figure out how to actually be able to execute those agenda items. But I certainly hope that that's something that's going to be in discussion when the national security strategies from the two countries come out, when our defense strategy comes out, and when your NDPG comes out. I think addressing both the capability development and the operational aspects and making sure that we're more combined on each, that has to be very, very high on the priority list.
Great, thank you. And I have another question. You talked about it's important to have a stable relationship with China. Then you talked about selective decoupling, which I think you still haven't explained to us. And then there's one question from the audience in advance that, will the US and Japan be able to decouple from China? And what and how long that would take, do you think? And maybe elaborate on selective decoupling, if you could, that would be very appreciated.
So I don't think we're going to fully decouple from China, and I don't think we should. I have two little kids, and a lot of their toys and shirts are made in China, and that's fine. They're very cheap. They're not particularly strategic. And there's nothing wrong with buying some basic goods from China. So I think what's dangerous is this idea that we have to be completely decoupled, right? I think where we have to be very careful, and where, in my view, we have to selectively decouple, is in areas where there are dual use risks. So if there are things that we have a real need for on the military side, I think we shouldn't be dependent on China for those. And we may need to input export controls into our systems that prevent us from selling, advanced microprocessors to China, which then can be used in certain types of military applications. So that's one area. The other area is one that you know much better than I, which is, areas where China either cutting off export or something, or cutting off import or something could do some real damage. So a good example of exports, right, was PPE, right, personal protective equipment, right? And people worry about this with pharmaceutical ingredients as well. There are some of these areas where China has a sort of dominant place in the ecosystem, in the supply chain. And China has shown in case after case over the last 10 or 15 years that it's willing to use these economic bits of leverage for coercive purposes. Obviously, it did this with Japan in 2010 over rare earth metals. It's done it with country after country in the last decade. And so I think we have to be very wary of having over-dependence on China in certain areas that give China strategic leverage. So as I said, if China tomorrow stopped selling kids' toys to the United States, it's not something we need to panic over. But if China stopped providing pharmaceutical ingredients that we're highly dependent on, that would be very, very serious, and almost immediately. And so when I say selective decoupling, I think these are the two areas. We will have to decouple in areas that have substantial strategic implications, and we'll have to decouple to some degree in areas that we're over-reliant on China, either as a production hub or as a key market. And I think this is doable. It will take time. It will be slow. It will be uncomfortable. Companies are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. And they're not going to do it overnight. And it will put some big companies at risk. And so I think what you'll see is not companies pulling out of China, but you'll see companies, opening up maybe some manufacturing centers in other places. So a good public example is that Apple is now making a lot of components in India and Vietnam that it used to make in China. It's not making everything in those places, but it is starting to decrease its dependence to some degree. And I think that kind of decision is the right one. But how you do that in a very structured, thoughtful way in cooperation between the government and the private sector is incredibly difficult. And here I'm much more optimistic about Japan's engagement on this. I think METI has been very thoughtful in how it approaches this issue. You know, in the United States, we struggle with this a little bit more. We don't have the history that Japan has, frankly, of industrial policy. We're trying to do a little bit of industrial policy now, but it is frankly awkward for our system to try and get used to this. And we also don't have a economic ministry like METI that is so powerful. We have smaller government agencies, which each have a part of this, you know, the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, the US Trade Representative, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the intelligence community. All of them have a piece of this pie, and it makes it very difficult for them to coordinate on these kinds of issues. But I think from my standpoint, that's the kind of thing we need to learn from Japan about how METI does this kind of cooperation. And we need to do it jointly, because if one country decouples and the other doesn't, we're still going to be quite vulnerable in some of these areas. So we can't selectively decouple one country at a time. We'll have to work together very closely in how we do this.
Great, thank you. Maybe one final question from me. There's also another question came from our audience, but I'm combining the question together. So we have seen in the shift in the US administration, Mr. Trump, Mr. Biden, so the change of the direction and often sort of confused us. So how do you see those, you know, the shift in this within the US administration for that affect to the foreign policy, security policy, and for the future, who are going to be the, you know, future US leader who can, you know, sort of shift everything back or to adjust the direction of the US, so to say?
Yeah, boy, it's such a tough question. And I think we have to be honest as allies that, you know, no one in Washington knows the answer to this question. So you're seeing movements on both the left and the right of the political side in the United States that sometimes are questioning the role of alliances. I'll just note that this has been longstanding in US history. You know, people ask these questions before World War I, before World War II, after World War II, after the Cold War. So this is nothing new. But look, I think we have to admit that, you know, the Trump years were a bit more of a divergence from this than we've seen at any point, certainly in my lifetime. And no one can be 100% sure what administration is going to come next, right? So we know we've got the Biden administration for two and a half years, but we could get Donald Trump again. We could get a different Republican. We could get a different Democrat. I think that the critical thing is there are a small number of countries that had good relations with the US under both Trump and Biden. And Japan is probably the top of that list, right? Every other country had a really difficult period with the Trump administration or with parts of the Biden administration, right? So I'll give you some examples. You know, Israel tended to be very close with Trump, but has a tenser relationship with Biden. You know, Korea obviously had a very tense relationship with the Trump administration at times. Japan, in part because of Prime Minister Abe, but not only because of him, managed to be maybe the only country in the world that had a genuinely positive relationship both with Trump and Biden throughout the time they both have had in office. And so, you know, when I step back and I ask, why is that the case? I think there are two reasons. One is very careful management from Tokyo. And I hope that will continue, and I expect that it will. But I think that the second reason is, you know, what we sort of started off with, which is the fact that our interests are just so closely aligned. And that even for some Americans who are questioning America's role abroad, Japan is still such an obvious partner. So don't get me wrong, you know, if I was having this discussion with some friends in Europe, or maybe even, you know, friends in the Philippines or Thailand, I might have a somewhat different answer. But I think, you know, from a US-Japan alliance perspective, I'm pretty optimistic that regardless of who's going to be in power in the United States, you're going to see Washington invest in the relationship with Tokyo because it's just so very clearly in our national interests, and I think in yours as well.
Great, thank you. With that, I'd like to pass the microphone to Dr. Kurokawa. He is here. And if you can unmute.
All right. Thank you, Zach. I think that's made it clear what we could do in this context, because I happened to be in Africa, North Africa, 2 weeks ago. This is more like development of Japanese responsibility to African countries. That's every 3 years, I think we have this session. But I think we could think about something, first step kind of thing. And I think we summarize our discussion today and then just make few sort of viable sort of recommendations to you and share with you and go further into what we could advise Japanese government. At least Hayashi-san is a Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's quite a smart guy and studied in East Coast. And so that maybe I thought about something tangible recommendation to current sort of ministers with our maybe 3 of us make few specific recommendations. So why don't we write this up and just make some papers and recommendation 1 to 3 kind of thing together, 3 of us. Because you made a very good point, of course, but making this into more political level is a bit harder. So I think we should start thinking about it. That was my thought throughout today's session. What do you think, Hiromi-san?
Okay.
Yeah. Why not?
I'm sure Zach had been writing a lot of proposals, and
Sure.
I'm sure he's been writing, but why not? And I think that's the purpose of this dialogue, that we continue to have discussion, and then, something come up from here, we can always, write up a paper and then propose it to the administration.
Sure, right.
Yes.
Why not? Yeah, because I think that's one way we could advance today's discussion, which is quite relevant to the Japanese government.
Yeah, we very much appreciate Zach for today's session. It was very informative, and it's very, sort of understanding of the current situation very well. That's made us to think further, what's really necessary.
Right.
So we very much appreciate Zach for today's session. I thank you very much.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to get to see good friends, and I hope to see you all in person very soon.
Right. Thank you.
Enjoyed
it very much. Thank you. Great.
Thank you very much. And with this, we'll be closing this session, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, everybody.